$100 billion a year. That's the value of today's market built on a discovery made by a Soviet lab technician without a diploma 100 years ago. Almost no one knows his name, not even in Russia where he lived and worked. He died of starvation at 39, but his invention surrounds us everywhere. Don't believe it? Then look at your smartphone right now. The bright screen, the camera flash. Now look around. The traffic light at the intersection, the TV screen, the dashboard in your car, even the lights on a Christmas tree. Every day we live in a world flooded with light that we take for granted. We're convinced that all this was invented somewhere in Silicon Valley, or at worst, in the high-tech labs of Korea and China. The worst part is that many Russians think the same way. Look what they can do, unlike us. And it never occurs to anyone that the very heart of this technology, the fundamental principle of how it works, was discovered almost 100 years ago. Not in America, and certainly not in Asia, but in the USSR. And this discovery was made by a 19-year-old guy from Tver, a city in Russia. But let's tell the story from the beginning. On May 10, 1903, a boy was born in Tver, Oleg Losev. His father was a nobleman, a staff captain in the Tsar's army. The family was intellectual, educated. But after the October Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War, nothing remained of the past. His father became a simple office clerk. The world in which Losev was born had vanished. The boy grew up in an era of great changes. Like many others then, he was caught up in radio fever. A school teacher, Vadim Levshin, a future academician, noticed his talent and supported him in every way. The main attraction for Losev became the Tver radio station. In Tsarist Russia, it had been working to communicate with allies since the First World War. Here, under the guidance of the legendary Mikhail Bonch-Bruvich, enthusiasts worked miracles in an era when radio tubes were a novelty. Imported tubes cost 250 rubles and lasted 10 hours, while they made their own in a makeshift laboratory for 32 rubles that worked for a month. Schoolboy Oleg spent hours in this laboratory that smelled of ozone and rosin, watching as the future was being born. But after the October Revolution, the laboratory was moved to Nizhny Novgorod. Losev, having finished school, was left alone. After participating in the first Radio Engineering Congress in Moscow, where he met his Tver mentors again, he was invited to work at that same Nizhny Novgorod radio laboratory near Moscow. This was a unique place. Here the line between science and engineering was blurred. Researchers were both theorists and practitioners in one person. And here, in a cramped closet, while respectable scientists were engaged in real science, vacuum tubes, this self-taught technician without a diploma began to create real magic. Oleg's boss, Vladimir Lebedinsky, assigned him to work on radio detectors. Losev searched for the right direction almost blindly. To make a crystal detector work, he had to poke it randomly with a thin wire. During one of his experiments, he passed current through a piece of zincite, a cheap mineral made of zinc oxide. Suddenly, clear radio transmission sound came through the headphones. But this transmission was so weak that an ordinary receiver shouldn't have been able to hear it at all. It turned out that the crystal had somehow amplified the weak signal. No one before knew that simple crystals could work as amplifiers. Losev created a crystal radio receiver called crystadine with zincite that worked as both detector and amplifier simultaneously. The penny crystal performed no worse than expensive tube devices, but no one could explain the principle of its operation. For thousands of radio enthusiasts across the country, Losev became a real god. Tubes were expensive, but here was a device for 1 ruble 20. They wrote to him from all over the country. With the help of a zincite detector in Tomsk, for example, you can hear Moscow, Nizhny, and even foreign stations. He was flooded with hundreds of letters, and they say he answered everyone. This was a genuine triumph. Already the next year, 1923, experimenting with another crystal, carborundum, silicon carbide, a material that later became the basis for the first LEDs, he saw what no one before him had seen. At the point where the needle touched the crystal, a tiny but steady point of light flashed. Losev made 2 crucial conclusions that were ahead of their time. The light was cold, meaning it appeared without any heating, and instantaneous. It flashed and went out instantly. like a perfect switch. Thus, Losev was the first in history to record cold luminescence in a semiconductor. Essentially, he experimentally discovered the LED long before it became a technology. But the most amazing thing, Losev studied dozens of different semiconductor materials during his lifetime. According to some sources, up to 92, including silicon. His experimental methodology was so advanced that, as an American scientist from RCA Laboratory later admitted, in the 1970s, American scientists at RCA used similar techniques to what Losev had used in the 1920s. However, this discovery played a cruel joke on its author. In the West, his works were reprinted by leading scientific journals such as Philosophical Magazine and Wireless World. He was called Professor, and the phenomenon itself received the official name Losev glow, Losev luminescence. In 1927, he even received Soviet patent number 221484 for a light relay, essentially the world's first LED device. And what about the USSR? In 1928, the unique Nizhny Novgorod Radio Laboratory was absorbed by the Central Radio Laboratory in Leningrad. The new structure had its own programs, and there was no place for Losev's revolutionary research. In academic circles, they looked down on him. All budgets and careers were built around vacuum tubes, and here was some lab technician with a pebble. Even academician Ioffe, who understood the scale of his genius, couldn't arrange a position for Losev. The system worked simply. Academics and corresponding members made it into reference books. But Losev? Make discoveries, please. But you're not entitled to glory. The fact was that in the 1920s, there was no complete theory of semiconductors. Scientists simply didn't understand the physical processes at the junction of crystal and metal that led to signal amplification and luminescence. His mentors, Bonch-Bruvich and Lebedinsky, seeing that the devices went sour and quickly lost their properties, considered this a dead-end branch incapable of competing with the reliable and understandable tube. Losev wasn't shot or sent to camps like many others. He was simply defunded, quietly pushed aside so he wouldn't interfere with serious work. He received his candidate degree without defending a dissertation only in 1938, through the personal patronage of academician Ioffe, who understood the scale of his discovery. But it was too late. The system had already passed its verdict. Ignore. When the war began, Losev remained in besieged Leningrad. He didn't sit idle. He developed a portable metal detector for finding shrapnel in wounds, a fire alarm system, donated blood as a donor to help the wounded. And what about his invention? An even more symbolic story happened with it. On January 22, 1942, Oleg Losev died of starvation in besieged Leningrad. His last work was devoted to silicon, but the manuscript was lost. And here's the cruel irony of history. In that same 1942, when the ashes of the Russian genius lay in a mass grave, American companies Western Electric and Sylvania began industrial production of silicon diodes for radars. The birth of the silicon age coincided with the death of its potential father. Americans picked up and developed ideas that the Soviet scientific system, absorbed with other priorities, had left unattended. A few weeks later, his colleague Dmitry Malyarov, co-author of the famous magnetron, the heart of future radars, also died of exhaustion. And you know what hurts the most? In 2001, Intel engineers studying the history of semiconductors stumbled upon Losev's forgotten works. They seriously began talking about reassessing priorities, suggesting that perhaps even a Nobel Prize would have been appropriate, even if posthumously. It turns out that American engineers know this Russian genius better than Russians themselves. Yes, today in Russia, there are memorial plaques, articles. However, how many such Losevs are we losing right now while watching this video? What do you think? Write in the comments. Perhaps you know about such a forgotten genius. Subscribe to the channel. We'll continue telling stories of Russian inventors whose names must not disappear. Because the next Oleg Losev might be living somewhere in Russia or any other country. And be sure to subscribe to our Telegram so you don't miss new videos.